The night air was crisp as Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting off the damp pavement. She shivered slightly, whether from the cool breeze or the lingering thrill of the evening. She wasn't sure. But before we dive into the story, drop a comment below about where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey, everyone. Richard adjusted his coat, his eyes searching hers. "You're quiet all of a sudden," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Penny for your thoughts." Emily let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Just thinking about how I never expected tonight to turn out like this." Richard smirked, his gaze lingering on her. "I get that. I don't usually do blind dates either. But tonight, I'm glad I made an exception." She hesitated, then nodded. "Me too." And to her surprise, she meant it. Richard took a step closer. There was a pause, the world around them fading as his gaze flickered to her lips. Then, instead of what she half expected, he leaned in and placed a feather-like kiss on her cheek. It was brief yet deliberate, sending a shiver down her spine. "Good night, Emily. I'll call you," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet promise before he turned and walked away. Emily stood still, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the night. Her mind raced, tangled between uncertainty and curiosity. She had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she was willing to find out. The next morning, Emily's mind was still clouded with thoughts of Richard as she drowned herself in work. But the distraction didn't last long. Her phone buzzed in the afternoon, an unknown number. "Hello, Emily, it's Richard. Coffee." She blinked, thrown off by his directness. Now. Unless you're busy." She should say no. She should focus on work, on her family, on all the problems she couldn't afford to ignore. But instead, she heard herself say, "Sure." The coffee shop was cozy, the scent of roasted beans filling the air as she stepped inside. She spotted Richard immediately, seated by the window, effortlessly confident, scrolling through his phone. As if sensing her, he looked up, his lips curving into a smile. "Emily, you look beautiful." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thanks. You look casual." He laughed, gesturing to his sweater. "What? Millionaires don't own hoodies." She smirked, taking a seat across from him. "I just expected something more polished." He leaned back. "I like to keep people guessing." They settled into an easy conversation, but beneath the light-hearted teasing, Emily felt something deeper brewing, a tension, an unspoken understanding. Richard was different. He wasn't just another guy trying to impress her. He was listening, really listening. "So tell me," he said after a moment, "how's work? How's life?" Her smile faltered. She hesitated. The usual answer would be a shrug, a dismissive fine. But something about Richard made her pause. She sighed. "Honestly, it's been stressful. My family's struggling with debts, and I'm the only one trying to hold everything together. It's exhausting." Richard's expression shifted. His playful charm softened into something unreadable. "You're carrying all of that on your own." She shrugged, forcing a light laugh. "It's just part of being responsible, I guess." His gaze didn't waver. "That's a lot for one person." She looked down at her coffee. She wasn't used to being seen like this, to being cared for, even in a small way. Richard leaned in slightly. "Emily, I know we just met, but you don't have to do this alone." Her head snapped up. "I don't need anyone's help." He didn't flinch. "I'm not saying you do. I'm saying you don't have to carry it all by yourself." She wanted to push back, to reject the kindness in his voice. But she also didn't want to lose whatever this was, this fragile connection forming between them. "I can't accept that kind of help," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "Not from you." Richard studied her for a long moment, then leaned back with a knowing smile. "All right, but if you ever change your mind, just know I'm here." The words lingered between them, unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. And for the first time, Emily wasn't sure if she wanted to run from them or towards them. The night air was crisp as Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting off the damp pavement. She shivered slightly, whether from the cool breeze or the lingering thrill of the evening. She wasn't sure. Richard adjusted his coat, his eyes searching hers. "You're quiet all of a sudden," he said, his voice warm and steady. "Penny for your thoughts." Emily let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Just thinking about how I never expected tonight to turn out like this." Richard smirked, his gaze lingering on her. "I get that. I don't usually do blind dates either. But tonight, I'm glad I made an exception." She hesitated, then nodded. "Me too." And to her surprise, she meant it. Richard took a step closer. There was a pause, the world around them fading as his gaze flickered to her lips. Then, instead of what she half expected, he leaned in and placed a feather-like kiss on her cheek. It was brief yet deliberate, sending a shiver down her spine. "Good night, Emily. I'll call you," he murmured, his voice carrying a quiet promise before he turned and walked away. Emily stood still, her heart pounding as she watched him disappear into the night. Her mind raced, tangled between uncertainty and curiosity. She had no idea where this would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she was willing to find out. The next morning, Emily's mind was still clouded with thoughts of Richard as she drowned herself in work. But the distraction didn't last long. Her phone buzzed in the afternoon, an unknown number. "Hello, Emily, it's Richard. Coffee." She blinked, thrown off by his directness. Now, unless you're busy." She should say no. She should focus on work, on her family, on all the problems she couldn't afford to ignore. But instead, she heard herself say, "Sure." The coffee shop was cozy, the scent of roasted beans filling the air as she stepped inside. She spotted Richard immediately, seated by the window, effortlessly confident, scrolling through his phone. As if sensing her, he looked up, his lips curving into a smile. "Emily, you look beautiful." She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thanks. You look casual." He laughed, gesturing to his sweater. "What? Millionaires don't own hoodies." She smirked, taking a seat across from him. "I just expected something more polished." He leaned back. "I like to keep people guessing." They settled into an easy conversation, but beneath the light-hearted teasing, Emily felt something deeper brewing. A tension, an unspoken understanding. Richard was different. He wasn't just another guy trying to impress her. He was listening, really listening. "So tell me," he said after a moment, "how's work? How's life?" Her smile faltered. She hesitated. The usual answer would be a shrug, a dismissive fine. But something about Richard made her pause. She sighed. "Honestly, it's been stressful. My family's struggling with debts, and I'm the only one trying to hold everything together. It's exhausting." Richard's expression shifted. His playful charm softened into something unreadable. "You're carrying all of that on your own." She shrugged, forcing a light laugh. "It's just part of being responsible, I guess." His gaze didn't waver. "That's a lot for one person." She looked down at her coffee. She wasn't used to being seen like this, to being cared for, even in a small way. Richard leaned in slightly. "Emily, I know we just met, but you don't have to do this alone." Her head snapped up. "I don't need anyone's help." He didn't flinch. "I'm not saying you do. I'm saying you don't have to carry it all by yourself." She wanted to push back, to reject the kindness in his voice. But she also didn't want to lose whatever this was, this fragile connection forming between them. "I can't accept that kind of help," she said finally, her voice quieter than before. "Not from you." Richard studied her for a long moment, then leaned back with a knowing smile. "All right, but if you ever change your mind, just know I'm here." The words lingered between them, unspoken possibilities hanging in the air. And for the first time, Emily wasn't sure if she wanted to run from them or towards them. Emily hesitated, gripping her coffee cup a little too tightly. "I won't." Richard blinked at the sharpness of her tone. A charged silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Emily exhaled and forced a small smile. "I mean, I won't," she repeated, her voice softer this time. His eyes searched hers for a moment before he nodded, a flicker of disappointment barely concealed in his gaze. But instead of pressing, he pivoted. "So, tell me more about your job." His voice was lighter now, steering the conversation back to safer ground. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of shared laughter and stories, favorite books, past travels, secret ambitions. But the weight of Emily's earlier refusal lingered between them like an invisible thread, pulling them back to the reality neither wanted to face. That night, alone in her small apartment, Emily stared at the ceiling, the city lights casting restless shadows across her walls. The evening had stirred something deep within her. Not just Richard's offer to help, but what it represented, a door to a life she had never allowed herself to consider. One where she didn't have to fight alone. But was she willing to step through it? The following days blurred together. Work was relentless, and the stress of her family's financial struggles pressed heavier on her shoulders. Yet, amidst the chaos, one thought remained constant: Richard. His voice, his words, his unwavering patience. He had offered her an out, but her pride wouldn't let her take it. Each night, she found herself staring at his number on her phone, typing out messages only to delete them before they could be sent. Asking for help wasn't in her nature. She had spent too many years being the one people relied on. Letting someone else carry even a fraction of her burden felt impossible. But avoidance had an expiration date. By the end of the week, fate, or maybe Richard's quiet persistence, made the choice for her. She walked into the cafe, her pulse quickening the moment she spotted him. He sat by the window, casually confident, the afternoon light catching the sharp angles of his face. When he saw her, he smiled, one of those smiles that made the rest of the world fade. "Emily," he said, his voice warm and familiar. She swallowed hard and took a seat across from him. "Hey." Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you again." "I wasn't sure if you wanted to," she admitted. His brows lifted slightly. "You didn't think I would?" She shrugged, suddenly feeling foolish. "You're busy." "I figured. Maybe it was just a momentary thing." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "It's not about being busy, Emily. It's about whether or not you want to see me again." Her breath caught. This wasn't just polite conversation anymore. His words felt like a challenge, a door left open, waiting for her to decide whether she would step through. She hesitated, fingers curling around the edge of the table. "Richard." He cut her off gently. "Look, I know you're used to handling everything alone, but you don't have to. I've seen what you're dealing with, and I want to help." Emily's spine went rigid. "I don't need your help. I can handle it." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Was it frustration? Understanding? Maybe both. "I know you can, but should you have to?" She looked away, the battle inside her waging war. Every instinct screamed at her to push him away, to keep her carefully built walls intact. But another part of her, the part that had spent too many nights staring at overdue bills, feeling the weight of her family struggles alone, was tired. The conversation drifted after that, back to safer topics. But the words they hadn't said hung heavy between them. When they finished their drinks and stepped outside, the cold night air wrapped around them. Richard reached out, his fingers brushing her arm. It was a small gesture, but it sent a ripple through her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "I meant what I said, Emily," he murmured. "I'm here, whenever you're ready." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "Thanks, Richard. I'll keep that in mind." She turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last, because deep down, she knew she wasn't just running from his offer. She was running from a possibility that, for the first time in her life, she didn't have to carry the weight alone. Something had to give. Emily couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. No matter how much she resisted, she knew Richard's offer was more than just a gesture. It was a lifeline she had been too proud to reach for. The following week was the hardest Emily had faced in a long time. Every day felt like she was walking through thick mud, slow, suffocating. Her mother called in a panic about a threatening letter from the bank. Her father's health had taken another turn for the worse, and the medical bills kept piling up. Every time she looked at her phone, she saw another missed call from an unfamiliar number. Creditors, most likely. Each call was more insistent than the last. And yet, amid the chaos, a quiet, almost desperate part of her longed for Richard's presence. His words echoed in her mind. Each time she thought about reaching out to him, she felt the weight of her own resistance. She was afraid afraid of what might happen if she let him in, and afraid of what might happen if she didn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of internal conflict, Emily picked up her phone and found Richard's number. Her thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating. She almost put the phone down again, but then she tapped it. The message was short, but it carried the weight of everything she had been holding back. "I need help." As soon as the message was sent, her heart pounded in her chest. The simple sentence felt like an irreversible decision, one that could unravel the carefully constructed wall she had spent years building around herself. She almost reached for the phone to delete it, but before she could, the 3 dots appeared on the screen. Her breath caught. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, Richard's reply came, direct, reassuring. "I'm here, Emily. Let's talk tomorrow. I'll make time." A dam broke inside her. She closed her eyes, feeling a rush of emotions she had tried so hard to ignore. Relief, fear, vulnerability, it all collided at once. She had agreed to meet him. The next afternoon, Emily stood outside the restaurant Richard had chosen. A high-end establishment, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed passers-by to peek inside at the glittering interior. Emily hesitated at the entrance. She had worn a simple dress, nothing extravagant, but still, she felt out of place. It wasn't just the restaurant. It was everything. The feeling that she was slipping into a world she didn't belong in. A world where people like Richard moved with ease, and people like her merely watched from the outside. Straightening her posture, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. Richard was already waiting for her. As soon as he saw her, he stood up and greeted her with that warm, knowing smile, the one she was beginning to recognize all too well. "Emily, I'm glad you made it," he said, his voice smooth but grounded. She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course. Let's sit down. I ordered a bottle of wine for us." "You like red, right?" he asked casually. Emily nodded. "Red is fine." Though, truthfully, the wine didn't matter. What mattered was that she had come here, finally willing to confront the reality of her situation and Richard's involvement in it. A waiter arrived, pouring them both a glass. Richard swirled his gently before taking a sip, then leaned forward, his gaze locked onto hers. "So," he said, "talk to me." Emily swallowed hard. The weight of his gaze made her words stick in her throat. How could she possibly explain everything? The pressure, the constant fear, the helplessness she had been hiding for months, no, for years. She took a deep breath, and the words finally came. "My family is drowning in debt," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "And it's all on me. I've been trying to pay it off, to keep the creditors at bay. But it's just too much. Every time I think I can catch a break, another bill comes in. Another threat." She paused, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyes. "It's like, no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." Richard watched her intently, his expression softening. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly heard. Finally, after a moment of silence, Richard spoke. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself," he said. "Let me help. Let me take some of that burden off your shoulders." Emily's stomach tightened. Panic rose in her chest. "No, I can't ask you to do that. I won't accept charity." "I'm not offering charity," Richard said, his tone unwavering. "I'm offering a partnership, a way for you to breathe again. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for the sake of your family. You deserve more than that, Emily." The way he said her name, it was different, as if he truly saw her, understood her in a way no one else had before. And that scared her, because she wasn't sure if she could handle it. "I don't know how this works," Emily admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know how to accept help, Richard. I don't know how to let someone in." Richard set his wine glass down, his expression gentle yet firm. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "You just have to let yourself try." The word hit her like a shockwave. Rest. She didn't know what that felt like anymore. Rest had become a luxury she could no longer afford. "I've never known what it's like to not be fighting," Emily admitted quietly, staring down at the table. Richard's hand rested nearby, inches from hers. He didn't reach for her. but his presence was enough to make her heart race. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You don't have to fight alone anymore. I can help. I want to help. Let me take care of the creditors. Let me make sure they stop calling you. You deserve to breathe, Emily." She swallowed hard, her thoughts tangling in a chaotic whirlwind. Could she really do this? Could she really accept help from him? "I don't want you to think I'm weak," she whispered, her voice cracking despite herself. Richard's expression softened. Without a word, he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt something she had forgotten existed. Safety. "You're not weak, Emily," he murmured. "You're stronger than you know. Accepting help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." She looked up at him then, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. "I'll take your help," she said, barely above a whisper. Richard gave her hand a small squeeze, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Good. We'll figure this out together." The following week passed in a haze of decisions, plans, and endless phone calls. For the first time in years, the relentless fear that had gripped Emily seemed to loosen its hold. The creditors stopped calling. The weight she had carried for so long didn't feel as crushing. And yet, new emotions surfaced, one she wasn't prepared for. Gratitude? Maybe. Something more? Definitely. Every time she saw Richard, every time she heard his voice, something stirred inside her. It wasn't just appreciation anymore. It was something deeper, something dangerous. One afternoon, Richard invited her to his office to finalize the last details of her family's debts. She hesitated before agreeing. His world, the polished, powerful one, was foreign to her. Intimidating. The towering skyscraper in the heart of the city gleamed under the afternoon sun. Glass, steel, precision. She stepped into the sleek lobby, feeling like a fish out of water. Everything screamed wealth, power, control. A poised woman with dark hair and sharp eyes greeted her immediately. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Lawson is expecting you. Right this way." Emily followed the assistant down a long hallway, the soft click of her heels echoing in the silence. The doors opened to a spacious, minimalist office lined with shelves, not of books, but abstract art pieces and sleek sculptures. The panoramic windows showcased the entire city below, making everything seem impossibly small. Richard stood by the window, his back to her. His tailored suit fit him effortlessly, the picture of quiet authority. When he turned, his smile was easy, welcoming. "Emily," he said, his voice calm. "I'm glad you could make it. Have a seat." She took a deep breath and sat down, trying to maintain composure. "Thanks for having me." She exhaled. "I don't know where to start." Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Start with whatever feels right. There's no rush." She hesitated. How could she explain everything without sounding like she was drowning in her own mess? Richard waited, patient. His presence somehow made it easier for her to breathe. Finally, she spoke. "I guess I'm still processing everything. You've done so much, and I don't know how to repay you." Richard raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do this for repayment, Emily. I did it because I wanted to help, and I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." His sincerity caught her off guard. She had spent so long believing that every favor came with a cost, that help was never truly free. She lowered her gaze. I don't know how to accept it. How do you just help someone without expecting something in return?" Richard exhaled, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Sometimes, the best thing you can do for someone is offer a hand when they're falling. No debts, no expectations, just being there." Emily swallowed hard. His words struck something deep, something fragile. She had spent her life believing she had to pay back every favor, that nothing was ever truly given without a price. But Richard was asking her to trust him, to believe him, and that terrified her more than anything. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "I want to trust you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the silence stretching between them. "I really do. But it's hard for me, Richard. I've spent so long doing everything on my own. I don't know how to let anyone else in." Richard's gaze softened. his expression unreadable yet comforting. He stood, moving around the desk until he was beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply placed a steady hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, yet electric. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said gently. "Take your time. But Emily, you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore." A breath hitched in her throat. For a fraction of a second, she allowed herself to lean into his touch, and something inside her shifted. She wasn't weak for needing help. She was human. His hand slipped away, leaving behind a warmth she wasn't ready to admit she craved. He smiled soft, reassuring, but filled with something deeper. "How about we take a break from all this business talk? I have a meeting in a couple of hours, but after that, let me take you to dinner. Just a chance to breathe." Emily hesitated. Spending time with Richard outside of a business setting was foreign, even unnerving. But the pull toward him was undeniable. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. "Dinner sounds nice." His smile widened. "Great. I'll have my assistant arrange something. We deserve a little break, don't you think?" As their meeting wrapped up, Emily felt an unexpected relief. Not just because her financial burdens were finally under control, but because, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't facing them alone. Later that evening, they met at a small restaurant near the water. The scent of salt lingered in the air, the gentle sound of waves creating an intimate backdrop. Here, Richard wasn't the powerful CEO behind a polished desk. And she wasn't just a woman drowning in debt. They were simply two people, sharing a meal and something unexpected. As conversation flowed, the tension between them changed. It was no longer burdened by financial strain, but by something unspoken, something thrilling, something dangerous. Richard leaned back, studying her with a knowing smile. "Tell me something you've always wanted to do, but never had the chance." Emily thought for a moment, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. "I've always wanted to go to Italy. The history, the art, the feeling of stepping into another world, it just seems magical." His smile deepened. "Italy, huh? Maybe one day we'll take a trip there." Her heart skipped. He said it so casually, yet there was a quiet promise in his words. The idea of traveling with him, stepping away from reality, sent a thrill through her, but it also terrified her. She was starting to want something more than just his help. The following days were an emotional whirlwind. No matter how much she tried to ignore it, something had changed. The line she had drawn between herself and Richard had begun to blur. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his words and his touch haunting her thoughts. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. One afternoon, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Richard's name flashed across the screen. "Emily." His voice was warm, familiar, soothing. "How are you?" She swallowed. "I'm okay. Just busy." "I was thinking," he said, his voice laced with something unreadable. "We should talk. Just the two of us. Meet me for a drink after work? I know things have been intense. Maybe it'll help to get away for a bit." Her grip tightened around the phone. A part of her wanted to say no, to maintain the careful distance she had placed between them. But the other part, the part that kept pulling her toward him, was too strong. "I'd like that," she admitted softly. "There's a place near your apartment. Quiet, low-key. I think it's exactly what we both need." An hour later, Emily found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, suddenly unsure of what to wear. It had to be simple, but enough. Not too much, but enough for him to notice. The tug-of-war between vulnerability and self-preservation was exhausting. When she arrived, the bar was dimly lit, intimate despite the gentle hum of conversation around her. She spotted him immediately, sitting at the bar, his profile outlined by the soft glow of amber light. Her heart pounded. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him, fully aware that tonight, everything was about to change. Emily stepped into the dimly lit bar, her heart already picking up pace. She spotted Richard instantly, his profile illuminated by the amber glow of the hanging lights. He looked relaxed, yet there was something in the way he held his glass, the way his gaze lingered on the ice melting inside, that made her pause. "Hey," she greeted, her voice slightly shaky despite her best efforts to appear calm. Richard turned, his signature smile curving his lips, the one that always made her stomach somersault. "Glad you made it. I thought this might be a good escape for both of us." She slid onto the stool beside him, and just like that, the distance between them shrank. They had both been through so much, professionally, emotionally. But here, in this secluded corner of the world, there was an unspoken understanding between them. A tension, a pull she wasn't sure how to define. Richard studied her, then leaned slightly closer. "What's been on your mind, Emily?" The question caught her off guard. He always had a way of seeing straight through her, past her carefully constructed walls. She hesitated, staring at her drink as if it held the answers. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, about how much you've done for me, for my family, and I don't know if I can accept it." Richard's expression softened, but he didn't interrupt. "I've spent my whole life trying to be independent," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not relying on anyone, not needing anyone. And then you came along and—" She exhaled, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know how to let you in." A beat of silence stretched between them before Richard spoke. "I didn't help you because I expected something in return, Emily. I did it because I care about you." Her heart skipped. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, so unwavering, so certain. She opened her mouth to respond, but emotion tightened her throat. "I know you're scared," he added, his voice gentle, "but you don't have to do this alone anymore." She swallowed hard. "It's not just that. It's not just about the debts or my family. The hardest part isn't accepting help. It's accepting that I want to need you." Richard's fingers brushed against hers, sending an undeniable spark up her arm. His touch was steady, grounding. "Then don't fight it." For the first time in years, Emily let the walls crack. Just a little. The flood of emotions she had buried deep within surged to the surface. Fear, relief, something else she wasn't ready to name. The evening passed in quiet conversation and stolen glances, the outside world fading. But as the night wore on, reality began to creep back in. Her family's situation hadn't changed. The debt still loomed, and even though Richard's presence had softened the weight of it all, she knew she couldn't escape it forever. The next afternoon, Emily's phone buzzed. Seeing her mother's name on the screen, dread coiled in her stomach. "Emily," her mother's voice cracked. "We got another letter. They're threatening to come by again." Emily's blood ran cold. "Mom, I told you not to answer their calls. They say they're going to take everything." Her mother's voice trembled. "What do we do?" Panic surged through Emily. She had thought Richard's intervention had bought them more time, but the wolves were still at the door. And this time, she wasn't sure how to keep them out. Emily's heart pounded as she gripped her phone, rereading the text from her mother. "They said they'll be here tomorrow. Please help us." Her fingers tightened around the device as a shiver ran down her spine. The weight of her family's financial troubles pressed on her chest like an anchor, dragging her deeper into the abyss. She had promised to fix everything, to protect them, but the truth was, she had no idea how to stop the inevitable. The city outside her apartment window was alive with neon lights and distant honking, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside her. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was no one to fight. Only faceless creditors and looming threats that felt more real with every passing day. Her phone buzzed again. This time, her heart jumped for a different reason. "Richard, can we talk?" Emily hesitated. She had kept him at arm's length, convinced that dragging him into her mess would be unfair. But right now, she was too exhausted to fight alone. "Emily, I need to see you." The response was almost instant. "Richard, I'm here. Anytime. Come over." An hour later, Emily found herself at Richard's penthouse. The space was different from what she had imagined, warmer, more personal, filled with small touches that made it feel lived in. A contrast to the cool, calculated businessman she knew. Richard opened the door, his gaze scanning her face, reading the unspoken turmoil behind her tired eyes. "Come in," he said gently, stepping aside. She hesitated, then walked past him, her mind racing. She had no idea what she was looking for. Comfort, answers, or maybe just a moment to breathe. You look like you haven't slept in days, Richard noted, closing the door. Wine. Emily gave a small, weary smile. That sounds perfect. As he poured the wine, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do anymore, Richard. He turned to face her, handing her a glass. Tell me. She exhaled shakily, gripping the stem of the glass like a lifeline. Every time I think I'm fixing things, something else falls apart. My family's drowning in debt. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. And now, they're coming for everything. Richard's jaw tightened. He set his own glass down and moved toward her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to fix this alone, Emily. Her walls shot up. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. He cut in, voice firm. I'm offering. Her throat tightened, her emotions threatening to break through. I don't know how to let go, Richard. I've spent my whole life holding everything together. He took her free hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. Then let me hold it with you. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Richard lifted his hand to gently wipe it away, his touch lingering. For the first time in years, she let herself lean into someone else's strength. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared of needing you. Richard's thumb brushed over her knuckles. You don't have to be. I'm not going anywhere. And in that moment, Emily realized neither was she. The morning sun painted golden streaks across her apartment walls, but Emily still felt the cold grip of uncertainty. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, and while part of her felt lighter, another part still resisted the vulnerability she had begun to embrace. Her phone vibrated, a number she didn't recognize. She answered, pulse spiking. Hello. Silence. Then a voice. Low. Ominous. We're closer than you think, Miss Carter. A chill ran down her spine. The call disconnected before she could respond. Her hands trembled as she lowered the phone. Richard's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to do this alone. But what if it was too late? The weight of fear loomed over Emily like a dark shadow, creeping into every corner of her mind. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother everything would be fine. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. I'll take care of it, Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Just don't answer the door, okay? I'll handle it. She hung up, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. The fragile sense of control she had clung to was slipping through her fingers like sand. Richard's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. But how could she let him in? How could she ask him to shoulder a burden that wasn't his to bear? She had spent years protecting herself, shielding others from her struggles. Dragging him into the chaos of her life felt unfair, impossible. That evening, Emily paced her small apartment, her thoughts tangled in a web of worry. She had tried to focus on work, but the weight of unpaid bills and looming threats kept pulling her back. Her phone vibrated on the table. She snatched it up, half hoping it was Richard. It wasn't. Mom, they said they'll be here tomorrow. Please help us. Tears welled in her eyes. She had promised to take care of everything, but reality was suffocating her. She had no idea how to fix this. Across town, Richard sat in his office, pretending to focus on the contracts before him. His thoughts, however, were consumed by Emily. Ever since their dinner, he had sensed the walls around her crumbling, but something still held her back. A fear, a hesitation he couldn't quite reach. He had given her space, waiting for her to open up. But patience had its limits, and an urgency clawed at his chest. He didn't just want to be near her. He wanted her to let him in. His phone buzzed. Can we talk? His heart clenched. Those 3 simple words carried the weight of something much deeper. Richard, of course. Whenever you're ready. An hour later, Emily stood at Richard's apartment door, her fingers curling into fists to stop them from shaking. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find here. Answers, comfort, or maybe just someone who wouldn't let her fall. She stepped inside, immediately struck by the warmth of the place. Unlike his sleek, professional office, his home was personal, inviting. Richard watched her carefully, sensing the battle waging inside her. Come in, he said gently. You look like you've had a rough day. Emily let out a small, hollow laugh. That obvious. He nodded toward the kitchen. Wine or tea? Wine, she murmured. As he poured the drinks, she finally spoke. I don't know what to do anymore, Richard. No matter how hard I try, I can't fix anything. The debt keeps piling up, and now they're threatening my mother. Her voice cracked, her mask slipping. I don't know how to stop this. Richard turned to her, his expression unreadable. He set the glass down and walked toward her. You don't have to fix it all alone, Emily. Her breath hitched as he took her hands in his. But I don't know how to let go of control, she whispered. I've always been the one to hold everything together. Richard's grip tightened, his warmth grounding her. You don't have to be anymore. Tears brimmed in her eyes. She blinked rapidly, but it was no use. The emotions she had buried for so long surged forward. Richard reached up, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders, Emily. I'm here. For the first time in years, she let go, just for a moment. And in Richard's arms, she didn't feel weak. She felt safe. Morning light spilled through the windows of Emily's apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. But even as the sun rose, she felt the cold grip of doubt creeping back. It had been days since that night with Richard. Part of her felt lighter, but another part clung to old fears. Could she truly rely on someone else? Could she trust him not to walk away? Her phone buzzed again. Richard, morning. Coffee on me today. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. This was new, scary, unfamiliar, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone. The cold night air bit at Emily's skin as she stood outside the small house her family had called home for years. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a symbol of resilience, of years spent fighting against life's relentless storms. And now, it was slipping through their fingers. Her mother had asked her to come over. The debt collectors weren't just knocking, they were pounding at the door, demanding more than just money. They wanted blood, a piece of their lives they weren't willing to give. Emily swallowed hard, pushing down the rising tide of anxiety. She had carried this weight for so long, always the protector, the one who held everything together. But she was cracking, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. She knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet street. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing her mother's tired eyes, shadows of exhaustion darkening her face. Inside, the kitchen table was buried beneath a mess of papers, bills, overdue notices, threats. Emily's stomach tightened as she sat down. Her mother's voice was barely above a whisper. They gave us 1 more month. But it's not just money they want, Emily. They want the house. The words sent a shiver down Emily's spine. What? They said we could strike a deal, her mother continued, hands shaking. But I don't trust them. And if we don't pay by next month, they'll take everything. Emily clenched her jaw, her nails digging into her palm. She had spent years keeping this family afloat. But this was too much. Her mother reached for her hand, her grip frail but desperate. I hate that you have to carry this burden, sweetheart. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. We'll figure something out, she said, though the words felt empty. Later that night, she found herself in Richard's apartment, her heart pounding. She hadn't told him everything before, not the full extent of the crisis. But now, there was no more hiding. Richard was in the living room, his focus on a stack of business contracts. But as soon as he saw her, his expression shifted to concern. He set the papers aside and stood. Emily, he said gently, what's wrong? She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. It's my mom. The debt collectors are threatening to take the house. Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't hesitate. That's not going to happen. She looked away. I don't know what to do anymore. I've fought so hard, but this is bigger than me. Richard closed the distance between them, his presence grounding her. You don't have to do this alone. Emily shook her head. I can't just let you fix everything. His eyes softened, but there was a quiet determination behind them. I'm not here to fix anything, Emily. I'm here to stand beside you, to fight with you. Her chest tightened. She had spent her whole life believing she had to do it all on her own, that leaning on someone meant weakness. But standing here, with Richard's steady presence beside her, she realized something. Strength wasn't about bearing the weight alone. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to let someone else carry part of it with you. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I don't know how to accept help?" Richard's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. "Then let me show you." For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to fight alone anymore. The cold night air wrapped around Emily as she sat across from Richard, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Here she was, opening up the most painful part of her life to him, something she had never allowed herself to do with anyone. "I don't know how to let go of this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know how to stop trying to fix everything myself." Richard cupped her face gently, lifting her chin so that she met his gaze. His eyes, full of warmth and certainty, locked onto hers. "You don't have to fix everything, Emily. You don't have to carry this weight alone," he said softly. His words were a lifeline, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe them. She had spent her entire life holding things together, being the strong one. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else share the burden. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Richard didn't hesitate. He pulled her close, wrapping her in his arms. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just let me be here for you." For a long moment, she simply rested against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And in that moment, something flickered within her, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Days passed, and Emily found herself slowly surrendering to the idea that she didn't have to do this alone. Richard didn't try to solve her problems for her, but he stood beside her, unwavering. He helped her navigate the financial negotiations, introduced her to his trusted advisors, and provided guidance without ever overstepping. More than that, he became her anchor. One evening, as they sat in his apartment, the city skyline shimmering through the vast windows, Emily looked over at him. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Richard had become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. "I've been thinking," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about my family, my life, all the chaos. And you." Richard raised an eyebrow, leaning back against the armrest, his eyes never leaving hers. "Go on." She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. "I've spent so many years trying to keep it all together, trying to control everything. But I can't do it anymore. I've learned that it's okay to need help, to trust someone else." Richard's expression softened, his understanding gaze reaching deep into her soul. "You don't have to carry it all, Emily. Not anymore." For the first time in her life, she believed it. She stood and crossed the space between them, her heart hammering. Without a word, she reached out, taking his hand in hers. It was a simple touch, but it spoke volumes. Trust, gratitude, vulnerability. "I've been scared," she whispered. "Scared of losing control. Scared of depending on anyone. But you've shown me that I don't have to do this alone." Richard stood, pulling her gently into his arms. "You don't," he murmured, pressing his lips to her hair. "I'm right here." The warmth of his embrace melted away the lingering fears in her chest. She had spent years building walls, convincing herself she didn't need anyone. But now, she saw the truth. What she needed wasn't control. It was a connection, and Richard had given her that in abundance. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and late-night strategy sessions. Together, they navigated the final stages of settling her family's debts. Richard's resources had provided a lifeline, but it was his unwavering support that truly allowed Emily to breathe again. The weight on her chest that had once felt suffocating had begun to lift. The storm wasn't completely over, but the skies were clearing. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without fear. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park near his apartment, the city lights flickering in the distance, Richard suddenly stopped. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that's happened in the past few months." Her heart pounded. There was something in his eyes, something raw, something real, that sent a shiver down her spine. She swallowed hard. Go on. He took a deep breath. I don't just want to help you through this. I want to be with you, Emily. Not just in this fight, but in everything that comes after. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that, for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overtake her. Richard, I want that too. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, and as he pulled her into a gentle, lingering kiss, Emily knew, no matter what lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face it alone. She had found her home, and it was right here, in his arms. Emily stood there, the cool evening breeze brushing against her skin as she faced Richard. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the uncertainty and hope tangled within her. The city lights shimmered in the distance, casting a soft glow over them, but all she could see was him, his eyes filled with something deep, something real. I don't want this to end, Richard said, his voice steady yet vulnerable. He took a step closer, his presence warm and reassuring. I don't want to just be someone who helped you through a tough time. I want more than that, Emily. I want you. Her breath hitched. A small, nervous smile played on her lips as her mind raced. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, afraid of depending on anyone, afraid of losing herself in someone else. But Richard, he had never tried to control her, never tried to fix her. He had simply stood by her side, unwavering, through every storm. Richard, I know it's not easy, he interrupted gently, his hand reaching for hers. I know we've both been through a lot, and maybe this feels too soon, but I can't ignore what I feel. I want to be with you, not just for a little while, but for the long haul. I want us to build something real, together. The weight of his words settled deep in her heart. He wasn't offering a fleeting romance or an easy escape. He was offering something solid, something lasting. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse racing. I've been scared too, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Scared of what this means, of what I might lose if I let myself fall. But I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want this, Richard. I want to take this chance with you. A slow smile spread across Richard's face, a mixture of relief and happiness lighting up his expression. He reached up, gently cradling her face in his hands, his touch sending warmth through her. Then let's do this together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of shared moments, laughter over late-night dinners, quiet evenings spent in comfortable silence, stolen glances filled with unspoken promises. Emily's family was slowly finding their footing, the weight of their financial struggles no longer suffocating them. And Emily herself, she was learning that leaning on someone didn't make her weak. It made her human. One evening, as they stood on Richard's balcony, the city stretching out before them, Emily felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and violet, and she turned to him, her heart light for the first time in years. I'm not scared anymore, she said softly, threading her fingers through his. Richard smiled, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her as if shielding her from all the uncertainties of the world. Neither am I. As the city lights flickered around them, they stood there, hand in hand, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. How did you like this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your score? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to catch all our stories. For more emotional tales, click here on the end screen.